Hello, everyone. This week we're going to talk about the perception process and how, even though we think we see a reality, there's really not a shared reality. So let's first take a look. Do you see a woman or do you see a saxophone player? Do you see a duck or do you see a rabbit? Do you see a tree with some birds or do you see a gorilla, a lion, and some fish? Do you see FedEx and the pointing arrow? Do you see a young woman or a ragged old lady? And finally, do you see Peter or the wolf? Looking at all these images shows us how varied and inaccurate our perceptions really can be. In order to understand a little bit more about these variations and inaccuracies, we need to take a look at our physical perception process that our body uses to process information. But before doing that, let's define what perception is. It's basically the process through which we take in information through our various senses from the world around us, and then we make meaning out of it using our brain and our experiences. According to your textbook, there's 3 main steps in the perceptual process, but I'm going to add a 4th. So first of all, let's talk about selection. We don't attend to all the information that's out there in the world. We only select certain information to attend to. So how do we determine which information to select and which not to? Intensity is one factor in our process of what we select. If something is different, louder, shorter, brighter, that makes us want to attend to it. We also tend to notice things that are contrasting or change. Our eyes will be drawn to things we will take for granted that what's normal. Repetition also influences our perception. If we hear something enough or we see it enough, we start to pay more attention to it. Our motives or situation can also influence what we attend to. For example, you probably never noticed all the equipment that baby owners have until maybe you have your own baby. Once we have attended to or selected information, then we go through the process of organizing it. This really means categorizing the information we're intaking against things that we already know. We call these things we already know perceptual schemas. These are like filing cabinets in our brain, and we organize things based on which file it goes into. That's the perceptual schema. There are many different schemas that we use to organize the information that we take in, but let's look at a few that are more common that influence your communication process. One way we organize this information is based on physical characteristics. We look at people's age, gender, and dress and make assumptions and put them into groups together. We also organize this information around roles that people play. For example, we have different schemas about how our best friend should act versus our boss versus our teacher. We also have schemas that go with different interaction styles. So for example, if we meet somebody who's gruff, we're going to attribute a whole group of personality traits to them. We also organize people based on certain psychological factors, basically looking at what we think their attitudes and values and beliefs are. So for example, if we find out someone's a Republican, there's a whole group of characteristics that we give to them based on that knowledge. You can see how this grouping of schemas helps us to interpret people in quick and easy ways. One danger is that schemas can easily become stereotypes. This is when we always attribute a characteristic to a person because they're in the group, and they can't change our thinking, no matter whether it's true or not. Once we have categorized the information based on our schemas, we now need to assign meaning to the information that we selected and organized. This is called interpretation. We use many factors in interpreting events and situations. So let's look at a situation. Over the last week, one of our coworkers has been being especially nice to us. They've been filling in for us and doing extra tasks even though they don't need to. We're trying to figure out what's going on. So one factor we might use in looking at how to judge a situation is how close we are to the person. If we're fairly close to the person, we might think it's just because we're friends. If not, we might consider that they have other motives. The next factor we might consider is how has that person behaved in the past? If in the past they've only been nice to us when they needed something, we might think that they're getting ready to give us a big ask. Otherwise, we might think that there's no big deal to it. Another factor that can determine your interpretation is knowledge that you have. For example, if you know that the coworker is in trouble with the boss for not getting along with others, you understand that their behavior might be related to trying to keep their job. Our attitude towards the individual may also impact how we interpret the behavior. So for example, if we're used to this person and think of them as being snooty and unfriendly, we'll be more suspicious of what they are doing. Our expectations may also influence how we interpret the situation. For example, if we expect other people at work to be nice, then we're going to think it's no big deal. But if we're used to people being kind of cold, then we need to think about it. Finally, our self-concept can influence what we think. So if we think we're not that good of a person and nobody's ever nice to us, then we're probably more suspicious when somebody is. Or if we have a pretty good self-image, we might just think they're being friendly. The final step in the perception process is negotiation. This is when we share our interpretation of events with others in the communication process, and we work together to gain a shared perspective. You can think of each individual's interpretation of the situation as their story or narrative of the event. We all have a little bit different narrative of what's going on, and we work together to try to create a shared narrative. If you remember from the beginning of the video, it's impossible for us to perceive everything, and sometimes our perceptions are just flat out wrong. There are many things that influence our perception, but in the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about just a couple that are important. First of all, our culture and what we see as right or wrong, or the right way to behave or the wrong way to behave, impact how we perceive items. Second, we can also misperceive people because we have stereotypes about a group that they're involved with. We also can be guilty of the primacy effect. That's when we let our first impression override any other information about a person. We stick to that first impression and don't ever allow it to change. The opposite of the primacy effect is the recency effect, and that's when we only remember the most recent information and not any of the history. Finally, one of the biggest perceptual errors is what's called perceptual constancy or perceptual sets. This is when we really don't allow or believe that anything's different than the way we want it to be. Whatever we believe today, we tend to find in the world the information that supports our beliefs. All of us seek to explain or reason why we have the perceptions we do. We call this process of explaining observed behavior attribution. For example, if I'm late to class, you can attribute it to any number of different meanings. We're going to talk about 3 in specific that you might attribute my behavior to. The first is locus of behavior, and this is when you determine whether or not I caused it internally to happen or whether something external caused it to happen. So if I'm late because it's internal, then it's because I didn't wake up on time and overslept. If I'm late because it's external, it's because there was an accident on the way to work. The next type of attribution is stability of behavior. It's whether you see what happened as the result of a permanent trait of me, or it's just something unusual and unstable. If we go back to the example of me being late, if I'm always oversleeping, you see it as a stable factor and permanent. If it's really unusual for me to be late, it's more likely that you see it as a one-time event. The final factor is controllability, and that's how much control you think I had over the situation. So for example, in our discussion about me being late, if it's because of a wreck, that really wasn't in my control. But if it's because I overslept, bad on you, Professor Bernhardt. One common attribution error is called the self-serving bias. And this is when we tend to attribute our success to stable internal causes about ourselves. And when we fail, we tend to blame the world, unstable, and external causes. A good example of this is if you get an A on a test, it's because you studied and you're really smart. But if you get an F, it's because the teacher's not very good and doesn't know how to write a test. Basically, the self-serving bias always says that you're kind of in the good position and the world is in the bad position. A similar perceptual error is the fundamental attribution error. And this is when we attribute other people's behaviors to internal rather than external causes. In other words, it's always their fault, good or bad. So if you've learned anything from this video, I hope that you understand that perception is complex and highly inaccurate. So from a communication standpoint, in order to be a good communicator, we need to understand that our perceptions are flawed, and we need to really pay attention to that negotiation phase. When we're in that negotiation phase, we need to understand that everybody's story seems real to them, and we need to listen and work to create a shared one.